He smirked while sipping his espresso, leaning just close enough to whisper in Swiss German, "They'll give anyone a badge these days, even if she can't spell her own name." He thought I didn't understand. He thought the language would protect him. I didn't flinch, not because I didn't hear, but because I had heard everything. Word for word. Accent, sarcasm, intent. That boardroom was full of white men pretending to ignore the tension, pretending I was invisible. And for years, I let them pretend. But today, I decided I wouldn't stay silent. If this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe. I share my real stories every week, and sometimes silence isn't strength. Sometimes strength speaks back. So I placed my tablet on the glass table. I looked him in the eye, and then I answered him, in perfect Swiss German. The moment I spoke, his face dropped. His assistant choked on her coffee, and the entire room froze. The espresso was bitter, just the way he liked it. He slurped noisily, seated at the head of the conference table like a king surveying his court. I sat at the far end, silent, focused. Not invisible, just treated that way. 12 white men in tailored suits filled the boardroom. The lights above buzzed faintly, and the glass wall to my left revealed a snowy Swiss skyline. The Zurich skyline was always breathtaking, clean, efficient, distant. Like this company. I glanced over my tablet. The presentation was ready. Market projections, product alignment, scalability, every slide loaded with precision. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing for this. 3 years rising through the ranks to even earn a seat at this table. And yet, here I was, still tested. He leaned toward the man beside him, a fellow executive, and muttered something in Swiss German. A chuckle, another mutter, then laughter, hushed and sharp like a blade drawn under velvet. They thought I didn't understand. Of course they did. Brown skin, American accent, female. To them, that equaled foreigner, non-fluent, non-threatening. But I caught every syllable, every smug, low jab. They'll give anyone a badge these days, even the janitor's daughter. Hope she knows which button is on. And then, with a raised brow, the CEO added, "Maybe she just smiles while the interns do the real work." I didn't flinch. I didn't blink. But inside, a fire that had been smoldering for years, quietly reignited. What they didn't know, what they never even considered, is that I'd grown up hearing Swiss German. My mother cleaned hotel rooms in Lucerne while raising 2 kids alone. While other children were playing, I was in the laundry closet with a dictionary, mouthing dialects while folding towels. I didn't learn the language to survive. I learned it to remember. And now, decades later, I was sitting here, being mocked in that same language, by men who still believed it was their secret code. My fingers stilled on the screen. The presentation didn't matter anymore. Not yet. I lifted my eyes slowly and met his. The CEO, Hartmann. He smirked, the kind of smug grin men wear when they think they've just won a private joke. He was still speaking, still confident I was just another checkbox in their diversity report. So I folded my hands neatly on the table. My voice didn't rise, it didn't crack. I just said in flawless Swiss German, "Shall I begin, or would you prefer to finish your insults first?" The room froze. Hartmann blinked, his smirk faltered. One executive actually dropped his pen. I waited. No one moved, no one spoke, except me, because now I had the room, and I wasn't giving it back. For a moment, the only sound in the room was the low hum of the ceiling light. No throat clearing, no coffee sips, no polite chuckles, just stunned silence. Hartmann's jaw worked silently, like a man searching for the emergency exit in a burning building. He stammered, then chuckled, a weak, brittle sound. "Ah, so you speak a little?" he asked, still in Swiss German, still playing it off. The others looked at him, then at me. I leaned forward, fingers interlocked on the table. "I speak more than a little," I replied, still in perfect Swiss German. "I speak enough to know when I've been called a janitor's daughter, and enough to remind you that even janitors raise legends." One of the senior partners shifted in his chair. Another avoided eye contact altogether. I switched back to English. "You assumed I couldn't understand, but I've understood this company for a long time. I've understood the lunches I wasn't invited to, the meetings where my suggestions were circulated later under someone else's name, the casual jokes in elevators, and now this." I clicked the remote. The presentation behind me blinked to life, but I didn't stand up. You were expecting a show, a pitch, a performance. Instead, you'll hear a story. Flashbacks filtered through my mind as I spoke. 19 years old, cleaning hotel hallways in Lausanne, sweating in silence while pushing laundry carts, pausing every time a guest barked Mädchen like I was their personal servant. At night, I'd sneak into the service elevator with an old Walkman and practice the sounds of Swiss German, the vowels, the guttural edges, the clipped endings. Not to impress, to survive, to own every room they told me I didn't belong in. Years later, I got a scholarship to the US, a degree in linguistics, then an MBA. I came back fluent in their language and fluent in systems, bias, power. I raised my voice now, not loudly, just enough. You mock what you don't expect to answer back. You ridicule what you think is powerless. Hartman fidgeted. The smile was gone now, replaced with tight discomfort. He reached for his tablet. I didn't stop him. This is not about a language, I continued. It's about assumption, and you assumed wrong. Then I did something none of them saw coming. I stood up, walked to the door, and opened it. In stepped a young woman, early 20s, dark-haired, nervous but determined. She held a laptop. Her name was Ria. Hartman squinted. "Who is this?" he asked, in English this time. I smiled. "This is who will be presenting today." Another silence. "This one is louder than the last. She's the intern," I added. "You've ignored her for weeks, but she knows this pitch backwards. She built the analytics pipeline you didn't read." I sat back down. Ria took the front of the room, and I watched as the same men who had smirked at me 20 minutes ago now leaned forward, not out of respect, but panic. The room didn't belong to Hartman anymore. And it sure as hell didn't belong to silence. You could hear the tension tighten like a noose. Ria stood awkwardly for half a second before she remembered her training. I had drilled her for this exact moment, not expecting the CEO would implode in front of his own board, but because I knew someday she'd need to know how to command a room that didn't want to see her. She opened her laptop, connected the cable, and in seconds, our projected data sprang to life on the screen. And then she spoke. Not nervously, not apologetically, not as an intern. She delivered a clear, sharp breakdown of Q3 strategy, our current client churn metrics, and the exact AI fixes we proposed for user retention. Every number, every insight, every explanation, she hit them like clockwork. I leaned back in my seat. Hartman, still at the head of the table, sat frozen like he didn't know whether to interrupt or vanish. I didn't give him the option. When one of the older partners whispered, "What's happening here?" I answered without looking at him, "A recalibration." This was never just about a pitch. This was about power, perception. And for once, they were going to see how it feels to be on the outside of the conversation. For years, I'd sat in this room and been talked over. Now, with every word Ria spoke, I watched that balance shift. The very girl they'd forgotten, overlooked, dismissed, was suddenly educating them. Calmly, elegantly, powerfully. I stole a glance at the far wall, floor-to-ceiling glass with a clear view of the Zurich skyline. You couldn't hear the city from up here. You could only see it. That's how they liked it. Distant, controlled, silent. But the silence in this room had turned on them now, and the discomfort was finally theirs to carry. Then, a buzz. Hartman's phone vibrated once, then again. He snatched it off the table like a drowning man grabbing a rope. He stared at the screen. I already knew who it was, so I stood. "Is it from Zurich?" I asked. He didn't answer, but I could see it in his face. The partners exchanged glances. Something was shifting, and they all felt it now. My own phone vibrated seconds later. I stepped outside the room to take the call. "She's presenting now?" the woman on the other end asked. "Yes," I replied. "We've received your documentation. HR will escalate immediately. But we have one more request before we proceed." I knew what was coming. Still, hearing it made me pause. "We'd like you to deliver the internal review, not just your complaint, your assessment." They were handing me the power to decide what happened to Hartman, not just as a victim, but as a professional, as his equal, or more accurately, as his replacement. I looked through the glass. Ria was on slide 4, still going strong. Hartman was squirming in his seat. I returned to my chair, clicked open my folder. "Tell Zurich I'm ready," I said, and this time I meant it. The door clicked shut behind me. I stood in the hallway outside the boardroom, my phone still pressed to my ear. My reflection in the polished glass walls stared back, calm on the outside, a thunderstorm behind the eyes. "We trust your judgment," the Zurich compliance officer said. Her voice was clipped, professional, Swiss to the bone. "You've documented everything. The board has reviewed the recordings from prior meetings. It's sufficient." It was more than sufficient. It was 14 months of witnessing rot from the inside and quietly gathering proof. Not because I wanted to tear anyone down, but because I was tired of watching men like Hartman use language like a weapon, racism like a smirk, and silence like a shield. I walked slowly back toward the conference room door, but didn't enter yet. Instead, I looked out the window. I remembered the first time I entered this building, 4 years ago. The security guard didn't believe I had clearance. I was holding a laptop bag and a resume that weighed more than his training manual. He looked past me and asked, "You're here to meet who?" Even now, on the elevator ride up this morning, a different guard tried to reroute me to HR. "That floor is executive only, miss." Because apparently executive and black woman still don't go in the same sentence, unless you force them together. Today, I was done forcing. I was rewriting the sentence. I opened the door. Ria had just finished her last slide. She turned to me, eyes searching for approval. I nodded, not just for her sake, but to mark the moment. She had earned their attention. I would now demand their respect. I walked to the head of the table, Hartman's seat, and placed a slim folder beside his untouched espresso. "Zurich has requested an internal assessment," I said evenly, "based on employee performance, leadership decisions, and alignment with corporate ethics." Hartman's face tightened. "You have no authority to." I cut him off, not loudly, just firmly. "I do now." The Zurich board had made it clear. They needed someone inside to deliver truth, not someone who had coasted on old money and worse manners. They needed a voice they could trust to assess the undercurrent of discrimination and not blink. I opened the folder. Inside, bulletproof documentation. Emails he'd sent at 2 a.m. to junior staff with a condescending tone. Meeting minutes that proved he'd overridden my proposals, only to recycle them weeks later with his name stamped on top. Quotes, verbatim, of the exact kind of low-frequency racism the world shrugs off until someone bleeds from it. "This isn't retaliation," I said, scanning the room. "It's reckoning." The men didn't nod, but they didn't interrupt either. The power dynamics had shifted, and they could feel it in the air like static before a storm. "Zurich asked me to speak," I continued. "So I will, and what I say next will determine whether this company rebuilds or burns." I took a breath, and I began reading. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to, because every word in that folder had been waiting. "Page 1, I began, sliding the document across the table toward the head of compliance. Email dated January 9th. Hartman refers to me as highly decorative but low impact in an internal chain meant for C-level staff only. Eyes dropped. Throats cleared. No one moved to defend him. Page 4, evidence that my Q1 risk assessment presentation was reassigned without credit. His email reads, "She had the numbers, I had the tone." Hartman shifted in his seat. His mouth opened, then closed. I kept going. Page 10, multiple reports from junior analysts stating that after late meetings, Mr. Hartman frequently commented on their accents, hair texture, and clothing not matching corporate image. And then came the last page. The page I hadn't planned to use until today. A transcript, not an email, not a meeting, but of a casual Friday lunch, one I wasn't supposed to hear but did, where he joked in Swiss German that the next diversity hire should at least pretend to be qualified. That sentence alone wouldn't have gotten him fired. Not in a world where racism dresses itself in humor and deflects as banter. But combined with everything else, it was a mirror held up to a face that had spent years avoiding reflection. I closed the folder. I've said what I came to say. I looked at the espresso cup in front of him, still full, untouched, like the man himself. Comfortable, bitter, stagnant. Then I did something that startled even me. I reached into my bag, pulled out my ID badge, the one that still reads Director of Strategy, and I placed it on the table. Effective immediately, I said, "I'm stepping into a different role." Hartman narrowed his eyes. "You can't fire me." I smiled. "I didn't. Zurich did, 3 minutes ago. You'll find the email waiting in your inbox." He lunged for his tablet. I opened it, scrolled. I froze. One of the board members, silent until now, finally spoke. "The vote was unanimous. Your severance will be managed privately. Security has already been contacted." Ria stared at me, her mouth slightly open. I gave her a subtle nod. This is what justice looks like. Not loud, not violent, just finished. Two men in dark suits entered quietly through the side door. Hartman stood, his chair scraping the floor, his arrogance peeled back now, layer by layer. He looked at me like a man drowning in a pool he once believed he owned. "This isn't over," he muttered, jaw clenched. I stood as well. "For you it is." And this time when I walked to the front of the room, I didn't need to speak Swiss German. I was fluent in power. They didn't clap, and I didn't expect them to. That boardroom wasn't built for celebration, especially not for women like me. It was built for calculation, preservation, and exclusion. But something had shifted, not in volume, in gravity. The power that had once sat with Hartman now hung silently in the air, and it was mine to catch. One of the Zurich directors appeared on the conference screen, live, remote, stern. "We've appointed an interim replacement effective immediately," she said. And then, as if reciting a grocery list, "Please welcome interim CEO, Miss Thompson." There was no applause, just a surprise. Stillness. Ria gasped under her breath. I heard it but didn't look at her because I couldn't look away from Hartman. He was still there, still standing, still clinging to some invisible rope he thought might pull him back to relevance. But no one tossed him a lifeline. Not one executive. Not one assistant. That's the thing about power when it's built on arrogance. Once the performance ends, so does the applause. The security officers flanked him politely. "You can keep the espresso," I said. "You'll need the caffeine. It's a long way down." He paused just long enough to register the humiliation, and then walked out. And just like that, the king had left the castle. And I wasn't his replacement. I was the rebuild. I stood behind the chair at the head of the table. Not in it. Not yet. I wanted them to see the distance, feel the shift, taste the silence they had weaponized against people like me for so long. "Let's be clear," I said, scanning the room. "I'm not here to rescue this company. I'm here to reset it." The compliance director nodded on the screen. "Zurich will support a full audit under your supervision. We want truth, not PR." I turned to the team. Some wouldn't survive the transition. Not because they were white, but because they were complicit. Others, they looked at me with the kind of gaze I'd never seen in this room before. Respect. Not performative, not political. Earned. I took a breath and finally sat in Hartman's old chair. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like balance. Long overdue. Ria lingered at the door, unsure if she should leave. I called her over. She stepped forward slowly, her posture unsure, but her eyes gleaming with something I recognized, fire that hadn't yet learned to roar. "How'd I do?" she whispered. "You didn't pitch," I replied. "You taught." She smiled. I saw the future with that smile. The new chapter wouldn't begin with my voice alone. It would begin with hers, and with every other voice this building had muted for far too long. The weight of the chair beneath me didn't scare me anymore. Because this time, it didn't belong to Hartman. It didn't even belong to Zurich. It belonged to accountability. And I planned to sit in it like it owed me interest. The boardroom emptied slowly, like the end of a funeral. Some whispered to each other on their way out. Others avoided eye contact altogether. But I didn't move. I sat in Hartman's chair, still as stone, letting the silence stretch until it belonged to me completely. Ria stood near the projector, arms folded, laptop clutched tight to her chest like a shield. Her confidence from earlier was flickering, replaced now by the usual questions that haunt women like us after we've done the impossible. Did I overstep? Was I too much? Will they try to punish me for it later? I saw all of it in her posture, so I said nothing. Not yet. Instead, I opened my drawer and slid a notepad across the table toward her. "You'll need that," I said. She blinked. "For what?" "Your next pitch," I replied. "This time, you'll open the meeting." She stared, unsure if I was serious. But I didn't smile. I didn't soften. "We don't just show them we belong," I said. "We bring someone in behind us every time we walk through a door." She sat down, slowly. And that's when I told her, not the sanitized version, not the resume story, but the truth. I told her about the time I corrected a white manager in a strategy meeting and he said, "Let's let the experts talk now." I told her about the time HR asked if I felt too emotional to lead after I reported a racist joke in Slack. I told her about the executive who said I was too polished to have come from where I came from, like excellence couldn't live in brown skin unless it had something to prove. Her eyes didn't widen in pity. They narrowed in understanding. "They'll always test your silence," I said. "That's their first language, but don't be afraid to speak back, in theirs or in your own," she nodded. Just then, an email pinged. From Zurich, the subject line, "Request to extend interim CEO role to permanent consideration." I didn't open it. Not yet. I closed my laptop, looked up at the skyline again, the same city that once ignored me, erased me, pretended I didn't belong. Now I stared it down from the tallest floor of the most powerful building in the company. And it didn't scare me anymore, because even if Zurich hadn't sent that email, I was no longer waiting for permission to lead. Ria reached for the notepad and started writing. I didn't need to tell her to, because in that moment, she realized what I had come to understand. The rooms they tried to keep us out of? We don't just enter them anymore. We rebuild them. By sunrise the next morning, I'd already written the first draft. It wasn't a press release. It wasn't corporate PR. It was a memo they weren't expecting, because it wasn't just about Hartman. It was about everything he represented. I titled it "Language, Power, and the Walls We Build." And I sent it company-wide, in English and in Swiss German. Every single employee, from Zurich to Lagos, from Paris to Singapore, would read it. It opened with a single sentence: "Silence is not neutrality, it is compliance." Then, paragraph by paragraph, I dismantled the company's long tradition of politeness as a cover for discrimination. I laid out the statistics. Only 2.3% of our senior leadership were people of color. 0 were black. Fewer than 6% of our international interns had been offered long-term roles in the past 5 years, most of them female, most of them brown or black. And despite every glowing diversity statement on our homepage, internal hiring data told the truth. They preferred familiarity over qualification. The numbers didn't lie, and I didn't soften the edges. I announced the launch of a new initiative, an internal equity audit, conducted by a third party, not a friendly consultant. A whistleblower protection unit, anonymous, funded, and truly independent. Mentorship pipelines for marginalized staff. Not just diverse hires, but future decision makers. Language bias training, mandatory, especially for executives. I closed the memo with a final line: "If your leadership is only comfortable when it doesn't have to listen, then it was never leadership." Within an hour, my inbox exploded. Some emails were short, "Thank you." Others were long, heartbreaking. A woman in Brazil who had resigned after being called exotic during a sales meeting. A black analyst in London who was told she was too urban to manage client accounts. An Arab programmer in Berlin who hadn't spoken a word in 2 years' worth of meetings. Because whenever he did, people acted like they were doing him a favor by listening. The memo had lit a fuse. Then came the LinkedIn posts. Someone leaked it, and I didn't care. I let it burn its way across the industry. By noon, my phone rang. A journalist. "We read your internal memo," she said. "Would you be willing to go on record?" I paused, not because I was afraid, but because I realized what came next wasn't just about the company. It wasn't even about Hartman anymore. It was about a new language, not French, not German, not English, but the language of truth. Once we were finally learning to speak out loud, I didn't do press, not because I was hiding, but because I needed to sit with it first, what had just happened and what it meant. It was only a week later, sitting alone in my office, that I opened the letter from Zurich. No ceremony, no press conference, just 6 words: "Your interim role is now permanent." I didn't cry, I didn't grin. I just sat still for a moment and stared at the screen. Because the truth is, it wasn't a surprise. Not after the memo, not after the silence that followed, not in resistance, but in surrender. They had known it all along. They needed me. They just never thought they'd have to admit it. I turned my chair toward the window. Zurich was quiet that morning, blanketed in early snow. The skyline glistened, white rooftops stretching out like a line of folded linen. I watched the world that once ignored me, and I thought of my mother, janitor, immigrants. Swiss by paperwork, never by perception. She scrubbed the backs of hotel toilets so I could sit at the front of boardrooms. She once told me, "They'll look at your hands before they look at your heart, so make sure they can never say both were idle." She died before she ever saw this building. But I imagined her now, walking down the hallway, carrying a mop bucket, not knowing her daughter would one day lead the company that overlooked her footsteps. And that memory? That's what broke me. Not Hartman's fall, not the memo going viral. That. I stood and walked to the shelf behind me, reached for the old hotel badge I kept in a frame, her name etched in plastic, A. Thompson, housekeeping. I ran my fingers across it. Then I opened the desk drawer and pulled out the last relic Hartman left behind, his espresso cup. Still full, still bitter, like the man himself, cold and unfinished. I didn't throw it away. I placed it on a separate shelf, a reminder that no matter how loud they mocked, no matter what language they used to belittle, the cup always stays full if you never drink the lie. There was a knock at the door. Ria stepped in, holding a notepad, eyes lit up. She was ready to debrief a new strategy. She paused when she saw me standing. "You okay?" I nodded. "I was just remembering." She looked at the framed badge. "Your mother?" "Yes." She stepped closer. "You think she'd be proud?" I exhaled slowly. "I think she'd ask me who I'm pulling up next." Because this was never about just sitting in the chair. It was about rebuilding the table and making sure no one else like me has to beg for a seat again. The first all-hands meeting under my leadership took place exactly 30 days after Hartman was escorted out. I didn't wear a power suit. I didn't quote a Harvard study. I didn't flash my resume on the screen. Instead, I stood in front of a crowd that was used to polished lies, and I spoke the one thing they never expected to hear from someone like me: truth. I began in English, then switched halfway through to Swiss German, not to impress, but to remind them that language isn't just about words. It's about who gets heard and who gets erased. I told them what leadership meant to me, not hierarchy, not silence, but integrity that speaks, even when it's uncomfortable. I spoke about my mother. I spoke about Ria. I spoke about every black woman, every brown intern, every overlooked genius who had ever been told their voice was too much, their presence too aggressive, their brilliance too loud. And then I ended the meeting the way I wish someone had ended it for me years ago. "You belong here," I said. "Not when you're perfect, not when they finally approve, but now, today, with your voice, your accent, your name, your fire. You belong." I left the stage not to applause, but to a kind of hush that meant something had shifted. Later that night, I returned to my office. The espresso cup still sat on the shelf. I looked at it one last time, and this time I picked it up. I walked it to the sink, poured it out, because I'd carried that bitterness long enough, and I didn't need it anymore. I know stories like mine aren't rare. They're just rarely told. But I'm telling mine, and if it found its way to you, maybe it's because you're ready to tell yours too. So if this story made you feel seen, if you've ever been mocked in a language they thought you didn't speak or underestimated because of who you are, don't stay silent. Leave a comment, share your truth, and subscribe to this channel. I'll be here every week telling the stories they don't want you to hear. Because the next room we enter, we're entering together. And this time, we're fluent.